Okay, welcome back. This is beginning of section 2.2 with asexual and sexual reproduction. I'm going to break the PowerPoints down into two sections. I'm going to do one section for asexual reproduction and another section for sexual reproduction. Up until this point, we have talked about the importance of natural selection. And basically what it comes down to is that organisms need to transfer genetic material so that the species can survive. So now what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about the mechanisms as to exactly how this genetic material or the proliferation of the species or the continuation of the species happens. How does it happen? So that's the question we're answering. Okay, so reproduction produces new individuals of a species, which of course is needed to ensure the survival of the species. The way a species reproduces determines how much variation a new individuals will have. There are two ways that individuals, that scientists know about for our purposes with respect to reproduction, and that is asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. With asexual reproduction, you do not get a lot of variation in the new individuals. In fact, in asexual reproduction, the individuals that are produced are identical to the parents. In sexual reproduction, where you get the fusion um, of genetic material from the male and the female parent, there's an opportunity there to create a lot of variation. So we can answer this question here at the bottom already. So we'll ask it again. Which produces greater variation in individual organisms? Would it be asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction? If you answered asexual reproduction, you are correct. But we've already just finished talking about that. So in asexual reproduction, only one parent is involved. The offspring are going to be exactly alike to the parent. So you can kind of think about it in this weird way. It's as if to say that the parent and the offspring are identical twins to one another. There are a few types of asexual reproduction that you need to know about. The first kind is called binary fission. The second one is called budding. The third one is called spore production. And the fourth one is vegetative reproduction. So these are all examples of asexual reproduction. So the important thing to understand with asexual reproduction is this point right here, is that the adult makes an exact copy of itself. So the offspring is going to look exactly like the parent, and the genetic material is going to be exactly the same. So the first one is binary fission. So what happens in binary fission is that the cell is going to split. The cell splits into two exact pieces of itself. So algae reproduce this way, a lot of bacteria reproduce this way, right? So only single-celled organisms and some protists, such as amoebas and some algae, reproduce by binary fission. So binary fission is a cell splitting exactly into two parts that are identical individuals. So just remember that. Again, remember, you got to break the word down a lot of the times to figure out what it means and use the context to help figure out what it means. So binary means two. How do I know it means two? Well, because of this little prefix here, bi, just like bicycle is, bicycles have two wheels, so it's two. Fission is splitting or dividing, and the cleavage is just forming an area where the division happens. So if we have a cell here, I'll try drawing a cell. So if we have a cell here, and it eventually undergoes asexual reproduction by binary fission, what's going to happen eventually is the cell is going to start forming a bit of a cleavage, which is just an indentation along here. And I should have drawn one also along here. So that eventually what happens is you get this division, right, kind of between the two cells. But as it progresses more and more, what's going to happen with binary fission is you're going to have something like this happen. We'll try drawing this. And you'll have the cell coming in, okay? Oh boy. And anyway, the vision's supposed to be deeper, and eventually what happens is this is what's called the cleavage here and here, and eventually it just forms into two um, um, not organisms, but two cells that are identical to the individual parent here. Okay. So the protistic kingdom consists of unicellular life forms. Uni here means one. Just think of unicycle. Okay, so that's just going to mean one. Unicellular life forms with only one cell have a nucleus. So the difference between protists and bacteria is that protists are a little bit more complex. They're more complex organisms. So budding. This shows an example of this shows a diagram of an organism called the hydra. And a hydra is a microscopic freshwater animal that reproduces by budding. And all what budding is it just grows an extension of itself. That's exactly of itself, and then eventually it just splits off. So you have this kind of process happening here, okay, and eventually splits off. When I see budding and hydra here, I think of a movie I saw many years ago called Army of Darkness. And in Army of Darkness, there is a scene in the movie where um, this person has a conflict within himself, and eventually actually shows, and it's a comedy movie. It eventually actually shows his darker side being born from within him, and it actually shows the dark side of him just kind of budding off of him, eventually creating a different person, and they have this duel. Another example of this, another analogy, I should say, not an example of budding, would be the classic story by Robert Louis Stevenson, where you have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and there are some movies about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or I can think of one anyway, where um, if you don't know the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's just about the scientist who takes a potion to try to get the evil part of people out and eliminate it, but eventually what happens is that it overtakes him. So the Mr. Hyde is the evil part, and in this movie it shows Mr. Hyde kind of budding off, of Dr. Jekyll. And anyway, it's just kind of an aside, hopefully to help you guys remember that budding is a form of reproduction where the offspring is genetically identical to the individual. It just starts off by budding off a piece of itself, and then eventually divides into its own identical self. Okay. So I'll let you have a read of this. It's pretty much kind of a summary of what I just said, so you can pause the video. Spores reproduction. So spore eventually divide into an individual that looks exactly like its parent. The interesting thing here is that a lot of people look at spores, and each of these individual guys right here are spores. I should probably use a different color. That here. So each of these little dots here are spores. The thing is, a lot of people would confuse this with seeds, and these are not seeds because seeds are produced from pollen, and pollen is produced from the male reproductive system of flowers, and the pollen is then deposited into the stigma, which is a channel that eventually leads down to the ovary, which is the female reproductive part of the plant. And so when pollen fuses with the ovary, it creates seeds. So seeds are a production, or sorry, are produced from sexual reproduction of plants. Spores are not. Okay. Um, Spores do not involve the formation of seeds at all. So they're similar, but what happens is that once spores are released, the spore themselves will divide into a new individual identical like the parent. Okay, so you can go ahead and pause the video and read this slide. Vegetative reproduction is very interesting. So vegetative reproduction is just if you take a plant and you take what's called a cutting, which is just an individual or like a segment of the plant, and if you were to water it, treat it, and make sure it gets all the nutrients that it needs, it would actually divide and form an identical um, copy of the individual species. So that's vegetative reproduction. And for example, I'm not really sure how to say this, but um, I'm going to say it's the Soleus plant. That's an O, by the way. It's very hard to. Um, the Soleus plant will reproduce by vegetative reproduction. So if you have the plant and you just take a cutting of it, that will divide eventually into the plant. So there are different forms of vegetative reproduction. And again, here's a good point. It does not involve the formation of seeds because as soon as you start talking about seeds, you're talking about sexual reproduction, not asexual reproduction. Okay, so the other example I didn't talk about was strawberries, right? Strawberries reproduce by growing runners, and what runners are is that they're literally just think about running on top of a land. So what happens is, let's say you have a plant here, okay? This is a plant. I'm not very good at drawing, and this is on top. It's just as the ground, right? What happens with strawberries is that they send these extensions out that are called runners. And then eventually, far away from the original plant, you have the reproduction happening where the runners will then develop into a genetically identical copy of the original parent plant. Another example of this are tubers, okay, which are these little ejectiles from I don't know how else to call them, but they're just these little extensions that come out of potatoes. So sometimes if you look at a potato, and some of you might see these things kind of sticking out from a potato, and you might look at that and think, "Oh man, that's so gross," you know. But those are tubers, and that's how um, potatoes can reproduce. That's a form of vegetative reproduction. Oh, it's right here. Okay, well there's an example of tubers. Um, so here aspen also reproduces by vegetative reproduction. So the important point here is right here. In all of these forms of vegetative reproduction, individual new plants that are produced will be genetically identical to the parent plant to one another. And the same is true of all forms of asexual reproduction. Okay, so I hope that that was helpful. We'll talk about sexual reproduction in the next slides.